Beneath the cornfields and cul-de-sacs of Ohio lies a forgotten world, one built in perfect circles, buried in sacred geometry and carved with secrets not even time could erase. Before history, before myth, someone walked this land and left behind riddles in earth, stone, and bone. Who were they? What did they believe? And why can't we explain a single thing they left behind? This isn't just the story of a place, it's the story of a silence that refuses to die. Welcome to 33 Ohio prehistoric mysteries that cannot be explained. The past is buried. Let's dig. Before we descend into the ancient unknown, take a moment to subscribe, because if this is your kind of mystery, you're exactly where you belong. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And more importantly, what time is it where you are right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Middle of nowhere? Middle of the night? Because these stories hit different when the world's a little too quiet. Great Serpent Mound, who built it, and when? Picture this. A 3, 4, 8 foot long serpent uncoiling in perfect curves across an ancient ridge in Adams County, Ohio. Its mouth agape, swallowing what appears to be an egg. The tail coiled into 3 mysterious loops. This isn't some forgotten lawn ornament left by aliens with too much time and geometry on their hands. This is the Great Serpent Mound, and nobody, not archaeologists, not astronomers, not even conspiracy theorists, can agree on exactly who built it or why. Carbon dating has only added fuel to the mystery. In the early 1992, samples taken from charcoal under the mound pointed to around 1070 CE, right in the heyday of the Fort Ancient culture. Case closed? Not exactly. Other data, artifacts, burial styles, and even earlier carbon samples point to the Eddy culture, more than 1,000 years earlier. 2 cultures separated by centuries, both with dramatically different worldviews, apparently occupying the same ground. The result? A prehistoric custody battle over one of North America's most iconic earthworks. And then there's the inconvenient little fact that this monumental snake just so happens to be perched on the edge of a prehistoric asteroid impact crater. Coincidence? Possibly, but it's hard to ignore the symbolism. A cosmic event leaves a scar in the earth, and someone centuries or millennia later carves a celestial creature over it. A sky serpent watching from the heavens, now curled permanently on earth. Some think the mound's curves track celestial alignments, solstices, equinoxes, even lunar phases. Others say it's a ritual site for fertility, rebirth, or death. A serpent consuming an egg, after all, is rich with metaphor. And some, the ones who really lean into the irony of it all, think the serpent wasn't a serpent at all. Maybe it's a comet, maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's just a prehistoric prank that we took way too seriously. You, dear viewer, are standing at the edge of that ancient ridge, looking down on coils of soil shaped by a people whose names we've lost, whose words we'll never hear, and whose meaning remains just out of reach. The earth is old, the myths are older. And Ohio? Apparently, it was in on the cosmic joke long before history started keeping score. But if the serpent was a celestial machine, then what about Newark? What if the land itself was a kind of calendar, and the next mystery is the gear that made it tick? Newark Octagon's lunar machine. At first glance, the Newark octagon earthworks look like just another ancient geometry lesson gone rogue. A near-perfect octagon joined to a wide circle, covering more than 50 acres. It's as if someone used a protractor the size of a city block. But here's the thing. This isn't just art. This is a machine. A lunar machine. The octagon tracks something called the lunar standstill cycle, an 18.6-year wobble in the moon's orbit. Every major and minor standstill, the moon rises or sets in just the right place to line up with those earthen walls. This kind of alignment wasn't even confirmed by Western science until relatively recently. Yet whoever designed Newark, they nailed it millennia ago. That precision demands a question. How? The Hopewell culture, most scholars agree, didn't have writing systems or metal tools. So how did they track the sky with more accuracy than many early civilizations who did? Was this astronomical wisdom passed down through oral tradition, trial and error over centuries? Or was it something more collaborative, a kind of prehistoric hive mind tuned into the rhythms of the earth and sky? Even if you accept that they tracked the moon, the real mind-bender is why. Was it a calendar? A site for rituals synced with celestial movements? Or was it a kind of spiritual amplifier, its geometry meant to harmonize human ceremony with cosmic rhythms? And why the octagon, specifically? It's a shape that doesn't occur naturally, not in terrain or biology, but in myth. It's a symbol of transition, a passage, a liminal space between order and chaos. Some scholars have suggested that the octagon wasn't just for watching the moon, it was for invoking it. That walking through the site during a standstill could have been a kind of pilgrimage, a time-bound rite in sync with forces beyond human control, a reminder that the moon rises and falls whether we notice or not. You could spend a lifetime standing at the center of the octagon, waiting for the moon to move just right, and still never feel like you've seen everything. But let's move west along the old, invisible pathways, to where the same builders carved a massive circle into the land, then dug a ditch, but not where you'd expect it. Because what kind of civilization builds a moat on the inside? Newark Great Circle's inner ditch. The Newark Great Circle is exactly what it sounds like. A nearly perfect 200-foot wide circle of raised earth, one of the largest in the ancient world. You stand inside it and feel like you've entered a forbidden zone or maybe the center of an enormous clock that no longer ticks. But here's the weird part. There's a ditch, not around the circle. Not protecting it, but inside it. That's not how moats are supposed to work. In any culture, in any age, moats are defensive. They keep things out. But the Newark Great Circle puts the moat inside its walls, suggesting it wasn't for defense at all. It was part of a performance, or a belief system, or something else we've forgotten how to read. And then there's Eagle Mound, the structure that once stood at the exact center of the circle. It wasn't a burial mound. It was a platform, a longhouse, possibly ceremonial, possibly symbolic, possibly a stage for rituals where nobody alive today knows the script. Every inch of the circle's design seems loaded with intention. The outer wall is about 14 feet high, enclosing a space large enough to hold a few thousand people. That's not domestic architecture. That's public theater minus the audience. Did they walk in silence? Did they chant? Was the inner ditch meant to reflect sound, water, the moonlight? Was the act of circling the ditch part of a spiritual journey, a rebirth, a reenactment of cosmic events? We build stadiums and call them sacred. They built circles and forgot to leave instructions. The Great Circle stares back at us like an inside joke carved into the earth, and yet it shares its DNA with something even stranger, a creature carved into a hill that may not even be what we think it is. Because the next mystery? It might not be an alligator at all. Alligator. Underwater panther. Mound. You can't miss it. High on a bluff above Raccoon Creek, a strange creature stretches its earthen limbs across the Ohio landscape. Long tail, outstretched limbs, a curiously shaped head. For over a century, people called it the Alligator Mound, despite the inconvenient reality that Ohio has never been home to actual alligators. And the mound? It looks nothing like one. So what are we looking at? Enter the underwater panther, a mythic beast known throughout the lore of numerous indigenous cultures across the Great Lakes and Midwest. Horned, feline, amphibious, a chimeric enforcer of balance. Part guardian, part trickster. You don't tame it. You don't invite it in. You just hope it lets you pass through the water without a toll. If the serpent mound was a cosmic snake curled on an impact crater, then this is its aquatic counterpart, a half-feline, half-dragon god watching over the underworld's entrance through Ohio's muddy veins. And that's where things get muddy in another sense. No one really knows how old this effigy is. Radiocarbon tests are inconclusive. Some say it's Edina. Others point to the Fort Ancient culture, again. But the Fort Ancient hypothesis creates a dilemma. Why would a culture that left almost no other effigy mounds suddenly build an enormous mythic animal on a hilltop? That's like finding a single Gothic cathedral in the middle of a minimalist desert. Even its location is cryptic. Built high on a ridge not for visibility, but possibly for proximity to the sky or to overlook a river. And its orientation? Not north-south, not even cardinal. It's offset, like a compass that only works in dreams. Some archaeologists have argued the figure doesn't represent a panther at all, or even an animal, but a spiritual metaphor. Others insist it's part of a ceremonial landscape that once stretched across this region, a missing chapter in a mythology whose pages were torn out by time, war, and progress. And still others just stare at it, as if waiting for it to twitch. Maybe the act of misnaming it the alligator mound is itself part of the mystery, a reflection of how modern eyes try to classify what ancient minds saw as fluid, sacred, and uncontainable. Maybe we can't see it clearly, because we're asking the wrong questions. If it was the underwater panther, then this mound isn't just a symbol, it's a warning. A reminder that the boundary between worlds is thin, and sometimes the things that live beneath the surface aren't sleeping. But what if this isn't just about individual creatures carved into the land? What if the whole landscape itself, miles and miles of earth, was being turned into a vast ceremonial machine? To find that answer, you'd have to walk the ancient road that may still run, just barely, beneath your feet. The Great Hopewell Road. Imagine a straight road, 20 to 60 meters wide, cut across southern Ohio's forests and fields. No cars, no wagons, no armies, just soil and geometry. Some say it stretched 60 miles, connecting the great Newark earthworks with Chillicothe's mound complexes in a dead straight line. No GPS, no drone view, no modern sense of why. And yet, straight as a moral question you can't answer. This is the Great Hopewell Road, or what remains of it. The thing is, we're not even sure it existed in full. Only fragments have been found. A few paired parallel ditches, subtle terraces, hints in the terrain, and LiDAR surveys. But what's compelling is the pattern, the sense that these weren't just isolated pieces, but parts of something massive, a kind of prehistoric corridor running through the heart of Ohio. And if it was real, then the implications are staggering. Was it a pilgrimage route? A path of initiation, lined with ritual stations? Did processions of people walk this road during solstices, moons, or mourning? Did the road itself have a rhythm, like a metronome between sacred sites? Others believe it was symbolic infrastructure, a declaration of unity made by mounding the earth itself. Imagine a civilization so in tune with its cosmology that it didn't build cities, it built meaning. Mile by mile, ditch by ditch, no bricks, just dirt aligned with stars. But even that idea has its paradox. For something so monumental, so vast, it has been nearly erased by time. Trees have swallowed it, subdivisions paved over it, farmers plowed through it without even noticing, and what remains is elusive, too faint to map, too significant to ignore. In a way, the road is like memory. You can't always see it, but sometimes it guides you anyway. And just when you think you understand the rhythm of these ancient designs, circles, lines, serpents, panthers, you find something stranger. Something that suggests these weren't isolated constructions, but interconnected mirror structures, echoing across the landscape like whispers across centuries. Twin octagons, identical orientation, hundreds of miles apart. What civilization does that? High Bank Works and Newark twin octagons. 2 octagons, 2 minds, separated by geography, maybe by time, but aligned literally. Newark and Highbank, two of the most enigmatic prehistoric earthwork complexes in the world. Both contain an octagon, and both are oriented the same way toward the northernmost moonrise. Pause for a moment. This isn't a coincidence you chalk up to lucky guesswork. These octagons are enormous, precise, and shaped in a geometry that isn't intuitive, not even today, with all our right angles and laser levels. To pull this off, the builders had to have shared not just knowledge, but something deeper. Intentional design across space. Highbank is in Chillicothe. Newark is over 60 miles away. No written language, no horses, no wheels, no maps as we know them. But somehow, they were communicating, copying, collaborating, competing. That's the mystery. And if both octagons were aligned with lunar standstills, then what kind of celestial logic governed their placement? Some archaeologists now believe the Hopewell were building a lunar landscape across Ohio, a network of sites tied to the moon's complex rhythms. Not random, not decorative, but systematic, ritualized. A worldview carved into soil and silence. The uncanny similarity between the two octagons suggests the Hopewell may have operated under a unified spiritual framework, one not defined by cities or nations, but by geometry and ceremony. The land was their text. The moon, their calendar. But we don't know what the ceremonies were. We don't know who was allowed to enter the octagon's sacred angles. We don't know whether these places were for the living or for the dead. What we do know is this. Across the landscape of ancient Ohio, meaning didn't sit in monuments, it moved through them. And the next place it moved? Into the rectangle and the circle. Two shapes joined by a long earthen avenue leading nowhere and everywhere. Hopeton earthworks' rectangle and circle. From above, it looks like the geometry homework of a student with cosmic ambitions. A massive square, nearly perfect in its corners and lines, tethered to a broad circle by a long earthen causeway. But this isn't just math you can walk on, it's the Hopeton earthworks, just outside Chillicothe, and it's one of the most elegant puzzles the Hopewell culture ever left behind. No one lives there now. No crowds, no cities, no highways of movement, just two enormous shapes carved into the earth, stubbornly quiet and maddeningly deliberate. The square spans roughly 950 feet per side. The circle measures about 1,050 feet across. The connection between them? A wide linear embankment, like a procession route or a cosmic umbilical cord. The site seems both symmetrical and strange. You expect a sort of Stonehenge logic. Maybe the corners align with solstices, maybe the circle mimics the moon, but nothing quite fits. The measurements don't add up to a clear celestial pattern, at least. Not one we've cracked yet. It's geometry in a foreign dialect. So, what happened here? Some say the square and circle represent a philosophical balance. Earth and sky, male and female, order and chaos. Or maybe the circle was a gathering space, and the square was a ritual precinct, cordoned off by walls made of dirt and sacred intent. But none of this is certain, because we still don't know the rules of the game. We're trying to reverse engineer belief from floor plans. What complicates things further is the site's scale. This wasn't a casual construction. The people who built it would have needed large teams, coordinated labor, and time, possibly generations. They weren't making a defensive fort. They were carving meaning into the earth, one basket of soil at a time. And what lies beyond the square and circle is just as compelling. The earthwork points down toward the Scioto River, as if the builders wanted it to connect not just to the heavens, but to the water below. Processions may have begun inland and ended by the river, or the journey could have gone the other way, a sacred exit toward the underworld. But if it was a procession route, then who walked it, and why? Were they mourners, pilgrims, dancers, or initiates? What kind of ceremony requires a half-mile of prepared ground just to begin? Nobody knows. And that's what makes Hopeton so eerie. It's not what's left behind that haunts, it's what's missing. The stories, the songs, the context. Everything human has been scraped away by time. All that's left is form without function, shape without script. The earth remembers more than we do. And not far from here, another group of ceremonial structures holds a chilling twist. Ritual buildings deliberately burned to ash, again and again, in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. Mound city groups burned charnel houses. Just a few miles away lies a site that feels almost sacrificial in its repetition. Dozens of small burial mounds, each one carefully constructed, and beneath many of them, the remains of a charnel house, a ceremonial wooden structure built to hold the dead and then deliberately burned to the ground. This is Mound City, a necropolis of secrets, where death wasn't a singular event, it was a process. Here's the pattern. A structure is built. Inside, cremated remains are placed, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes not. Then the structure is burned. Then a mound of earth is raised over the ashes. And then, in some cases, the process begins again. New structure, new burn, new mound. Repeat. But why burn the house? Some suggest it was about transformation, fire as purification, a way to release the spirit by destroying its shelter. Others think the building itself was part of the soul's journey, that it had to be sacrificed alongside the body in order to maintain cosmic balance. Still others believe the charnel houses weren't just for the dead, that living rituals were performed inside rituals that prepared the body, the spirit, and the community for what came next. A funeral is one thing. A multi-layered, generational ritual cycle is another. And then there's the eerie uniformity. Many of these houses were roughly the same size, same construction, same materials. It's as if there was a blueprint one passed down through generations like a sacred architectural gospel. But instead of preserving these buildings, the Hopewell chose to erase them with fire, over and over. Was this symbolic? A way to signal that permanence was dangerous or illusory? A warning against holding on? Mound City doesn't just challenge our understanding of prehistoric religion, it taunts it. Every mound, every burned structure is a closed door. You can measure it, map it, excavate it. But you can't step inside the ritual that once danced in that now absent space. And just when you think it couldn't get more mystifying, nearby at another site, they did it again, but this time on a monumental scale. Seip Earthworks' monumental charnel hall. Welcome to Seip Earthworks, a colossal ceremonial complex in Ross County, where geometry meets ritual and nothing is small, not the scale, not the ideas, not the mysteries. Here, among the largest and most elaborate Hopewell structures ever found, archaeologists uncovered something startling. The remnants of a massive charnel hall, larger than anything found at Mound City. This wasn't just a house of the dead, it was a cathedral of passing. The structure itself may have stood 150 feet long and 60 feet wide, with wooden posts rising into the air like ribs from a great skeleton. Inside, altars, burials, offerings, ceremonial arrangements that suggest not mourning, but performance. The size alone forces us to reconsider the scale of Hopewell society. Something this large wasn't built overnight. It would have required planning, labor, coordination, and perhaps most importantly, shared belief. A consensus of meaning so strong that hundreds, maybe thousands, of people agreed to build something whose purpose we still don't understand. And just like the smaller charnel houses at Mound City, this monumental structure was burned, intentionally, but not before being used in complex, layered ways. Was it for initiation rites? Astronomical observation? Seasonal rituals? A convergence of the living and dead in a ceremony so potent it had to be consumed by fire? Nobody knows. But one thing is clear. Seip wasn't just a burial site. It was a stage, a place where ideology, cosmology, and spectacle collided. It may have been the most significant performance space of its time, and we don't even have a name for the production. And the eeriest part? Seip's charnel hall wasn't isolated. It was surrounded by geometric earthworks, a large circle, a square, parallel walls all meticulously arranged. The entire site may have functioned like a cosmic complex, movement choreographed by lines in the land, meaning transmitted not by words, but by walking the right path at the right time. From Seip, you can almost hear the echo of a drum. You can almost see the flicker of torchlight in a wooden hall, now turned to ash. And as the ceremony ends and the fire consumes what's left, you find yourself standing at the next enigma, a nearby mound filled with hundreds of carved pipes, buried in a single act of unfathomable intention. Tremper Mound's massive effigy pipes. They were carved with care, some even with reverence. Bears, owls, falcons, beavers, a whole menagerie of ancient Ohio wildlife, frozen mid-pose in stone. Some creatures were real. Others were mythic. All were rendered with startling detail, as if the artist had seen each one up close, perhaps even listened to their stories. And then, after all that intricate work, they were placed carefully into a chamber and burned. That's the riddle at the heart of Tremper Mound. Located in Scioto County, Tremper is a modest-looking mound with an immodest history. What it lacks in height and grandeur, it more than makes up for in symbolic intensity. Because this isn't just another burial, it's a mass deposition, a ritual act so deliberate and so saturated with meaning that it still sends shivers through modern archaeology. Inside the mound, archaeologists discovered a cache of over 200 effigy pipes, each unique, each handcrafted, and many previously used. The pipes weren't thrown in carelessly. They were arranged, selected, intentionally gathered for what seems to have been a singular event, a collective act of spiritual theater with fire as the final punctuation mark. Why? That's the impossible question. Why would a group of people pour time, skill, and sacred intent into crafting effigies only to burn them and bury the remains? These weren't simple tools. They were ceremonial instruments. Some might have been personal. Others could have belonged to a priestly class or a traveling group of spiritual performers. Whatever their origin, they were meant to be seen, held, used, and then never used again. One theory? The pipes were offerings, sacrifices of symbolic power, gifted to the earth or the ancestors. Another theory suggests they were connected to a closing ceremony, a final ritual marking the end of a cycle, a life, or even an entire cultural phase, like burying not just objects, but an era. There's something unsettling about the images carved into them. A hawk's talons curled as if mid-flight, a human face with blank eyes, a panther crouched in stillness. The expressions are too specific, too personal. These weren't just icons, they were avatars, representations of forces, animals, deities, spirits, or inner selves. And then there's the fire. Why burn them? The burning complicates everything. If it was a final rite, then fire might have been a release. If it was a purification, then perhaps the smoke carried the spirits upward. Or maybe it was a kind of ritual severance, breaking ties with power that had become too dangerous to keep. Some scholars have pointed out that this kind of mass deposition, especially of pipes, isn't found anywhere else in this region. Tremper stands alone. Whatever happened here, it didn't happen often. And if it happened once, it may have been enough. But it didn't happen in isolation. Tremper sits near the Scioto River, in a dense corridor of ceremonial earthworks and sacred geometry. It's part of a larger story, a broader spiritual cartography that once blanketed Ohio. And it's not the only mystery to vanish beneath the weight of modernity, because just up the road from Tremper, an entire complex once as famous as Stonehenge is gone, bulldozed, flattened, forgotten. But not entirely, because for those who remember, and for those willing to piece together the fragments, there's still a ghost in the geometry. Circleville's lost circle and square. Before it was Circleville, it was something else, something older, something profoundly weird. Picture a nearly perfect circle, about 1,200 feet in diameter, joined seamlessly to a 900-foot square. Together, they formed a ceremonial complex, so striking in design that early European settlers built their new town directly over it, using the ancient forms as a street grid. Because nothing says we respect ancient sacred geometry like turning it into a real estate plan, the name Circleville wasn't poetic, it was literal. But over time, as cities do, the old geometry became an inconvenience. Circular streets confused people. Developers wanted symmetry, so by the mid-1800s, the circle was obliterated. The square was divided. Houses were built, and a masterpiece of prehistoric urbanism vanished beneath the logic of colonial expansion. Today, all that's left is speculation and a few early maps, drawn by settlers who may not have known what they were looking at. Those diagrams show the circle and square joined by short walls, with a gateway pointing northwest. Inside the circle, there may have been mounds or wooden structures. Or maybe it was left open, a sacred void. Nobody's sure. But the layout matters, because in Hopewell culture, these geometries weren't arbitrary. Circles signified unity, cycles, sky. Squares signified order, structure, earth. Joined together, they formed a cosmological conversation, a bridge between worlds. So what was Circleville? A temple? A city of the dead? A theater for rituals that blurred the line between performance and transcendence? We'll never know. Not just because it's gone, but because even when it stood, the meaning was buried in culture, language, and belief systems that didn't survive contact. All we have now are echoes. A few sketches. A street name here and there. Maybe the occasional moment of déjà vu when you realize the road you're driving on curves in a way that doesn't make sense unless you knew what was buried beneath it. Circleville is a case study in how mysteries aren't always lost to time. They're sometimes buried by progress. A sacred site can become a parking lot. A cosmic design can turn into zoning regulation. But even then, the shape lingers, like a scar under pavement. And just when you think these geometries are as strange as it gets, you reach a place where the earth itself becomes a processional route, a stairway to the river, a graded slope of unknowable ceremony. Because in Marietta, the sacred doesn't stand still. It moves downhill towards something ancient and wet. Marietta's sacra and platform mounds. Marietta, Ohio, doesn't make a big show of itself. It's quiet, river-bound, full of weathered bricks and small-town charm. But buried beneath its sidewalks and post offices lies a blueprint that predates the city by thousands of years. A ceremonial complex of mounds, embankments, and, most curiously, a gravel slope that leads in a straight line from the central platform mounds down to the river. It's called the Sacra, Latin for sacred way, and that alone tells you everything and nothing all at once. On the surface, it's just a pathway. About 150 feet wide, gently graded, flanked by low embankments, leading from the ceremonial core of the ancient site down to the banks of the Muskingum River. But it wasn't a road in the modern sense. It wasn't built for trade. It wasn't a shortcut. It was something else entirely. A processional passage, meticulously aligned and purposefully constructed to choreograph movement, not traffic. Whoever walked it did so with intent. The Sacra Via began between two elevated platform mounds, rectangular, flat-topped earthworks that may have supported temples, ritual structures, or viewing platforms. From there, the path descended like a ceremonial river of gravel toward the water, an echo of the very flow it eventually reached. You didn't just walk the Sacra Via. You entered it, you descended it, and you participated in whatever cosmic drama it was designed to manifest. And here's the question that nobody can quite answer. What happened at the river? Was it a place of symbolic rebirth bodies or objects carried down, submerged, or sent away? Was the river a spiritual boundary, the liquid edge between the physical world and the afterlife? Or was it just part of a larger choreography, with the journey more important than the destination? Archaeologists have tried to piece together the meaning based on the geometry, the soil layers, and the few fragile artifacts left behind. But all they can really say is this: the shape is intentional, the alignment is deliberate, and its orientation seems to suggest a relationship not just with the river, but with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, perhaps even lunar phases. In other words, it's not just an earthly passage, it's cosmic. And it's unique. Nothing else like it has been found in North America. Not in that shape, not in that context, and not with that combination of architecture and movement. The Sacra Via stands alone as a symbolic highway to nowhere or everywhere. Modern Marietta has preserved parts of it, but only barely. Much of the ancient complex has been paved over, built upon, or lost entirely to centuries of urban development. The remnants of the platform mounds still stand, fenced off in quiet parks. Tourists walk past them with dogs, children, sandwiches. Few realize they're circling the remnants of what may have been a grand stage for soul-shifting ceremonies. The irony is sharp. The city that inherited sacred geometry decided it needed a post office more. And yet, the idea persists. You can still stand atop a platform mound and look down the line of the Sacra Via, imagining processions of people in ritual garb walking solemnly toward the river. Maybe they carried offerings. Maybe they carried the ashes of the dead. Maybe they carried ideas, meant to be dissolved in the water and carried away downstream into legend. It's a rare thing to feel both awe and confusion in the same breath, but the Sacra Via demands it. It was made for movement, but its purpose has gone still. It was shaped for meaning, but the meaning has faded like footprints in gravel. Still, there's one thing that pulls at the thread of understanding: a sense of distance. These people, the Hopewell, or possibly their cultural precursors, weren't just building in one place. They were building across territory, mapping ideas into landscapes, repeating forms across vast distances. And nowhere is that more dramatically demonstrated than at Portsmouth, where the land doesn't just echo sacred geometry, it sings in stereo. Because what happens when a ritual complex stretches not for 100 feet, but for 8 miles? Portsmouth earthworks, 8 miles of geometry. Portsmouth, Ohio, might be where ancient Ohio decided to go full epic. We're not talking about a single mound or a neat little circle here. We're talking about a monumental system, an interconnected lattice of circles, squares, parallel walls, and avenues that once sprawled across 8 miles of river valley, across both sides of the Ohio River. One design, two shores, like a cosmic equation divided by water. Try to map it, and your brain starts to ache. Circles linked to squares, pathways connecting to mounds, linear embankments that cross miles of floodplain with eerie precision. And at the heart of it all, the overwhelming sense that this wasn't just construction. It was coordination, across geography, across time, and maybe even across tribal lines. That's the mystery. Did a single culture build it all at once, in a sort of prehistoric infrastructure blitz? Or was it a cumulative effort, maintained and added to over generations? Were these ritual paths walked by isolated clans, or did they serve as a pan-regional gathering place, an ancient pilgrimage site that drew people from all over? And here's where the questions deepen. Why build it on both sides of the river? Water wasn't just a barrier, it was a threshold, a mirror. So maybe these earthworks were meant to reflect each other, two sides of the same sacred experience. Or maybe crossing the river was part of the ceremony. A rebirth, a test, a transformation. In a world without bridges, that crossing would have carried meaning far beyond practicality. One especially bizarre feature is a path that seems to lead directly into the river, much like Marietta's sacra. Was this another sacred exit? Did people enter the river on purpose, stepping from engineered soil into natural current? The answer, again, is gone, washed away, like so many others, by time, erosion, and the heavy hand of development. Most of Portsmouth's earthworks are now beneath houses, roads, factories. Some of the circles are ghosted in street names. A few small portions survive in parks or under historical markers, but the totality is lost. You'd need LiDAR, imagination, and a very patient drone just to grasp the outline of what once stood here. But here's the quiet revolution. Even in its ruin, the pattern survives. The plan is too strange to be forgotten entirely. And that strangeness, it pulls at something in the mind. The thought that once, long before borders and titles, a whole landscape was used not for ownership or farming, but for belief, for ritual choreography, scaled up to match the stars. And as you stand at the ghost edge of what was, where parallel walls vanish into a modern neighborhood, you have to wonder, what kind of civilization builds this, and then disappears? One clue might lie in the name of the next mystery. A site with a name that screams military precision, but might have nothing to do with war at all. Fort Ancient, the earthwork, not the culture. It's the kind of name that dares you to misunderstand it. Fort Ancient, the largest hilltop enclosure in North America, a place so massive, so intricately constructed, that early European settlers assumed it had to be a fortress, defensive, martial, a prehistoric stronghold built to keep enemies at bay. Except, it probably wasn't. To be clear, this isn't about the Fort Ancient culture, a later indigenous group named after this place. This is about the site itself, a sprawling, elevated complex in Warren County, Ohio, enclosed by more than 3 miles of earthen walls, punctuated by 66 gateways, perched 270 feet above the Little Miami River. Fort Ancient, the location, is like a giant earthen crown draped over a wooded ridge, regal, deliberate, and stubbornly enigmatic. If it were a fort, it would be the least practical one ever devised. The walls aren't uniformly high. Many of the gateways face out into open ravines. There's no inner keep, no barracks, no sign of sustained occupation, no piles of weaponry. The site is not positioned for optimal defense, it's positioned for view. Panoramic views of the valley, the sky, the land stretching in all directions. So what was it? Some scholars argue it was ceremonial, that the walls weren't meant to keep people out, but to guide them in. That the 66 openings were not vulnerabilities, but portals, thresholds that marked transitions, possibly astronomical alignments, possibly symbolic stations on a pilgrimage circuit. A prehistoric ritual labyrinth, if you will, scaled up to an architectural level so massive it could only be walked to be understood. Others suggest it served as a gathering site, a location for festivals, seasonal observances, intergroup meetings. The interior holds flat plazas, mounds, and indicators of possible wooden structures. But if this was a social or religious center, the scale is still daunting. Who exactly was meant to gather here, and how often? Then there's the rhythm of the place. The sinuous walls don't just loop around like a chain link. They undulate, rise and fall. They mimic the ridge's natural contours, but with enhancements, exaggerations that feel theatrical. As if the builders were coaxing something out of the land, rather than imposing a geometry onto it. Some believe that Fort Ancient was a kind of ritual machine, a place where the movement of people mirrored the movement of celestial bodies, or the phases of life and death. The way the pathways twist and turn would force a kind of ritual pacing. You don't march here. You meander. You arrive in stages. Even the embankments themselves carry mystery. Built with alternating layers of earth and clay, Some sections appear to be deliberately stabilized to withstand erosion, suggesting knowledge of construction principles beyond simple piling. This wasn't just a big dirt wall. It was engineered, and engineered to last. And it has lasted. It's been here for over 2,000 years, outlasting the cultures that built it, outlasting colonial attempts to rename, reframe, or repurpose it. The name Fort Ancient sticks, even as the logic behind the label crumbles under scrutiny. But perhaps that's fitting. It's easier to call something a fort than to confront the possibility that it was built for purposes we no longer have words for. In a world obsessed with defense and boundaries, we forget there were once civilizations that built not to defend, but to reveal. That shaped Earth not for battle, but for transcendence. And just when you think Fort Ancient is the peak of prehistoric architectural oddity, you find its stony cousins rising from the hilltops to the south. Places where the earth gives way to stone, where the ceremonial switches to something harder, older, stranger. Next up, the high hilltop enclosures of southern Ohio, where stone walls whisper secrets no one's managed to decode. Fort Hill's stone-walled mountaintop. Imagine standing on a ridgeline, breath shallow from the climb, surrounded by trees and wind, only to find yourself staring at a stone wall, not modern, not broken-down farm fencing, but ancient, purposeful, monumental. This is Fort Hill, a summit enclosure in Highland County, unlike most others in Ohio's prehistoric world. The structure loops around the ridgetop for nearly 1.5 miles, enclosing about 35 acres. Its walls are made not of earth, but stone, stacked carefully without mortar, with 33 known gateways. Again, like Fort Ancient, the name misleads. There's no evidence this was a fort. And if it was possibly the least convenient fortification ever attempted, perched atop a steep, forested mountain, with no easy access to water, no signs of long-term settlement, and no strategic advantage, unless the strategy was cosmic. That's where the theories begin. The first problem is, why stone? The vast majority of Hopewellian and Eddy earthworks across Ohio are made of soil, painstakingly moved basket by basket. But here, they chose stone. Was it due to local availability, or did the builders attribute symbolic significance to it? Stone lasts. Stone weighs. Stone carries a permanence that soil resists. If this place was meant to endure not just physically, but spiritually, then stone would have been the medium of choice. Some believe Fort Hill was an observatory, a high vantage point for watching the sun, the stars, the moon. The wall's shape is irregular, following the ridgeline, but some alignments may correlate with solstices or equinoxes. Others think the site was ceremonial, a high-altitude sanctuary where rituals were performed above the world, closer to the sky gods or spirits that lived beyond the tree line. There are no known burials inside, no houses, no infrastructure. This was not a village. It was a destination, and one that required effort to reach. Which brings us to the wall itself. It's not a continuous barrier. It's punctuated by openings, gateways, 33 of them. Not random gaps, but intentional breaks in the otherwise unbroken stone. Were these stations in a ritual path? Were they aligned with stars, cardinal directions? Or did each portal represent a phase of a journey, a symbolic rebirth experienced by walking the circuit? Whatever the purpose, Fort Hill feels like an island of belief, suspended above the forest, surrounded by silence. Climbing it today feels strange, not because of ghosts or danger, but because of how out of sync it is with modern logic. There's no reason to build something like this, unless reason wasn't the point. And Fort Hill isn't alone. Just a short distance away lies another mountaintop anomaly, where stone and sky again collide, and meaning slips further from reach. Because the next mystery? It might not have been built for people at all. Spruce Hill's stone fort. On a hilltop plateau in Ross County, Ohio, where the trees now creep in like quiet intruders and birdsong fills the otherwise absolute silence, there rests another of the state's enigmatic elevated sanctuaries. Spruce Hill. It's called a stone fort, much like Fort Hill and Fort Ancient, and just like them, the name almost certainly gets the point wrong. Spruce Hill is strange even by the already strange standards of prehistoric Ohio. The site consists of a massive enclosure spread across roughly 140 acres, ringed by a stone wall, a rare and deliberate construction in a region better known for earthwork architecture. Most of the wall has collapsed into ruin, overtaken by vegetation and time, but it once stood tall enough and thick enough to impress even modern surveyors. Some estimates suggest over 8,000 tons of stone were used. No easy task, no quick build, and no obvious reason why. There are no signs of domestic life inside Spruce Hill. No hearths, no homes, no everyday refuse. This was not a community fortress, not a settlement perched above danger. In fact, the steep climb just to reach the top would have made it highly impractical as a military base. You don't haul tons of stone up a hill for the sake of defense when there's nothing up there to defend. What you might do it for is ceremony, or ideology, or cosmology. This is where things shift from confusing to poetic, because some believe Spruce Hill was not a fortress at all, but a ceremonial enclosure deliberately placed at altitude to interact with the sky. The openness of the plateau, combined with its sweeping views and the enclosed perimeter, might have made it a kind of ritual sky theater, a stage for celestial observance, or for rites that required both privacy and proximity to the heavens. And then there's the question of timing. The cultural attribution of Spruce Hill is debated. Is it Hopewell? Earlier? Later? No definitive artifacts provide a timestamp. The wall's construction, made from unworked stone, stacked without mortar, could date to nearly any prehistoric era, which leaves us with intention as the main clue. And the intention is complicated. Why stone? Again, that question rises. In a world of dirt mounds and wooden structures, this is stone on a hilltop where hauling that material was a feat of dedication. If labor equals value, then Spruce Hill wasn't just important, it was sacred. And not in the convenient, feel-good way modern audiences like to use that word. Sacred as in non-negotiable. Sacred as in worth the effort, no matter how hard. But what if the site wasn't just about who went up the hill, but what came down? Some theories suggest Spruce Hill was part of a sky-earth ritual loop, where observers or shamans would ascend to perform ceremonies meant to interact with celestial forces, then descend with knowledge, visions, or spiritual authority. A kind of prehistoric mountaintop university, where the curriculum was dictated by stars, clouds, and whatever entities the ancient world kept in its upper floors. That would explain the absence of dwellings. This wasn't for living, it was for becoming. And there's an eerie energy to the plateau itself. People today report a certain disorientation while walking the perimeter. The tree line bends in odd ways. Sound behaves strangely. You could dismiss that as coincidence, or you could see it as a kind of resonance, a leftover hum from rituals long forgotten. Either way, Spruce Hill doesn't feel like a place that invites answers. It feels like one that withholds them. And if Spruce Hill was a site of ascent, of deliberate separation from the everyday world, then its sibling mystery just miles away. Another stone-ringed summit adds another layer of confusion. Because next comes a place where stone walls and burial mounds coexist, throwing off the neat categories scholars love to use. A site that seems built not just for elevation, but for containment. Not just for watching the sky, but for storing something within. And what lies within might explain why this site remains as unreadable as the others. Glenford Stone Fort. Deep in the forested hills of Perry County, far from the ceremonial corridors of the Scioto River Valley, a different kind of monument slouches toward obscurity. the Glenford Stone Fort. Like Fort Hill and Spruce Hill before it, Glenford presents itself as a hilltop enclosure, a massive ring of stacked sandstone built high above the surrounding landscape, walled in with intention but shrouded in silence. But Glenford has something the others don't, a stone burial mound inside the enclosure, a mound that complicates everything. It's this interior presence that makes Glenford unique. Whereas other stone enclosures might suggest gathering, ritual, or celestial observation, Glenford's central mound introduces the unmistakable scent of mortuary practice. This was not merely a stage for the living. It was a container for the dead, or perhaps more precisely, for what the dead had become. The stone walls are no small feat. Built from the local sandstone outcrop, the perimeter stretches across hundreds of meters, enclosing around 26 acres of high ridge. The stones are uncut but carefully placed, the wall varying in height and thickness depending on the topography. This wasn't built to be impenetrable. It was built to define space, to say, inside this wall things are different. But different how? Was Glenford a place of pilgrimage, a tomb complex, a celestial sanctum? If the burial mound is central and symbolically it is, then maybe everything else was built around it. A kind of spiritual fortification not against people, but against forgetting, or against something getting out. And then there's the location. Unlike the vast river valley complexes, Glenford is remote, wooded, and isolated. Its builders didn't want to be found. They wanted to be apart. Removed from commerce, travel, maybe even from time, and that isolation seems to have worked. For centuries, the site remained hidden, preserved by the forest, and protected by its sheer inaccessibility. But even isolation doesn't explain the design. Why go to the effort of walling off a mountaintop with stone, then placing a burial mound inside that enclosure? Was it symbolic an effort to contain spiritual energy, or mark a boundary between worlds? Or was it practical, a way to protect remains from grave robbers or rival groups? There's no evidence of extended occupation here. No dwellings, no middens, no infrastructure. Just stone, silence, and the occasional artifact that hints but never explains. Some researchers believe the site may have once included wooden structures atop the stone wall watch stations, perhaps, or ceremonial posts. Others suggest the central mound was used not just for burial, but for ongoing ritual engagement, a site revisited across seasons, generations, or celestial events. But those are just theories. What we have is a wall, a mound, and an atmosphere. The kind of place where even birds seem to fly quieter. Where wind presses through the trees like it's remembering something you can't quite reach. And the pattern continues. Each site adds a layer. Each hilltop structure contradicts the last. And just when you think the puzzle pieces are forming a picture, another outlier appears. Because, just west of here, at the confluence of two rivers, another so-called fort waits, long and narrow, perched on a ridge like a spine, and still holding its breath. Miami Fort at Shawnee Lookout. Where the great Miami and Ohio rivers meet, there's a high, narrow ridgeline flanked by steep drops and ancient silence. It's the kind of place that was born to be misunderstood. You can walk its spine, feel the crunch of dried leaves underfoot, and not realize that you're tracing the outline of one of Ohio's strangest and least understood prehistoric earthworks, Miami Fort. Let's start by saying what it's not. It's probably not a fort, not in the military sense. There are no signs of battle, no defensive towers, no caches of weapons, no warrior graves. And yet, early surveyors in the 1802 slapped the word fort onto it, because that's what people tend to do when they find long walls on high ground. It's a tidy label. One size fits all. But as with so many sites in Ohio's ancient earthwork catalog, the name fits about as well as a suit of armor in a baptism. Miami Fort consists of a series of earthen embankments that snake along the ridgeline for nearly 3 miles, enclosing a long, narrow plateau with precipitous drops on nearly every side. The walls are low by defensive standards, just a few feet high in many places, and punctuated by openings that don't make sense if your goal is to repel an attack. From above, it's less of a fortress and more of a processional envelope, a container for movement, a walled stage for something more elusive than combat. So, what was it for? Some archaeologists have proposed that Miami Fort was a gathering site, a location used seasonally by communities for ceremonies, meetings, or ritual events. The commanding view of the river confluence below could have played a symbolic role: two rivers, meeting like two worlds, or two paths of existence. In many indigenous belief systems, the joining of waters is sacred, a crossing point, a transformation site. Miami Fort stands like a sentinel at that junction, high above it, watching the eternal merger below. Then there's the wall itself. It's not a circle, it's not a square. It's not a shape that fits cleanly into any known geometric tradition of the Hopewell or Eddy cultures. It's long, uneven, snaking, adjusted to the contours of the land. It follows the natural edge of the plateau, enhancing what nature already started. This isn't about imposing symmetry, it's about working with the earth, about honoring its lines rather than overriding them. Inside the enclosure, there's very little evidence of daily life. No long-term habitation, no organized village. What you find instead are traces, suggestions, indications that people came here, did something important, and left, possibly again and again, possibly generation after generation. The pattern echoes that of other enigmatic sites, ritual use, not residential. There are also signs of earlier Eddy presence artifacts like projectile points and pottery fragments that hint at millennia of layered activity. But the Hopewell signature looms largest. If they inherited the space, they reshaped it, reimagined it, turned a high ridge into a conceptual precinct. What makes Miami Fort especially haunting is how little we know about what took place within those long, winding borders. Did people walk the ridge in procession? Were chants sung to the river spirits below? Did shamans or leaders stand at the high points and address a crowd assembled in ritual silence? Or was it more personal than that, a place where individuals came to commune with ancestors, gods, or memory? The walls don't answer. They only follow the land, like thoughts you can't quite finish. And then there's the time question. When exactly was Miami Fort built? Some parts of it may date back 2,000 years or more. But without definitive carbon samples from structural elements or reliable stratigraphy from undisturbed sites, the age remains speculative. Which adds another twist. This could have been a palimpsest, a site used and reused by multiple cultures across centuries. Each group adding, erasing, repurposing, until even the builders wouldn't recognize the final version. But what they all seemed to agree on was location. Miami Fort doesn't sit at the edge of a village or along a trade route. It crowns a natural overlook where two rivers become one and where vision, literal and symbolic, extends for miles. If you want a metaphor for Ohio's prehistoric landscape, this is it. A high place, hard to reach, wrapped in walls that make no military sense, overlooking a mystery you can't quite solve. And the next stop? We descend from the heights into a valley filled, not with one earthwork, but dozens, each one a perfect, perplexing circle. Like stepping into a geometry lesson taught by someone who refused to explain the final exam. Wolf Plains Group. Somewhere between pattern and obsession lies a place where circles breed like spores. On a river terrace just outside Athens, Ohio, you'll find Wolf Plains, a strange constellation of low, circular mounds spread out across a grassy plain like the remnants of a forgotten code. They're not huge. They're not flashy, but there are dozens of them, forming one of the densest groupings of earthworks in the entire state. And nobody knows what they mean. No walls, no squares, no serpent or panther effigies, just circles, everywhere. More than 30 ring-shaped mounds, some overlapping, some in proximity, others seemingly isolated. They form no clear path, no obvious grid, no astronomical alignment that anyone has confidently decoded. They just exist. The layout has driven researchers and armchair theorists alike to mild insanity. Are the mounds graves? Possibly. Some have produced cremated remains or evidence of ritual fire, but others are empty deliberately so. Perhaps, were those symbolic burials? Offerings? Did each mound represent a spirit? An idea? A moment? A family line? And why so many? Why so close? You could argue it was a cemetery, but if so, it doesn't resemble others from the same era. There's no hierarchy of mound size, no central structure, no defining monument. It's a community of circles, all speaking in the same quiet tone, none rising above the others. A society of equals, a ritual terrain meant for shared participation. Another theory suggests they're the remnants of dance circles or gathering rings, each one used for ceremonies now lost to time. But then why leave them intact? Why build so many, then walk away? Wolf Plains is sometimes described as a cultural island. It exists in relative isolation from the larger Hopewell and Eddy epicenters. Its style doesn't fully match either tradition. It's like a dialect of earthworks spoken by a community whose name we no longer remember. And that anonymity is part of its power. You can walk through the fields today, past the quiet mounds, and feel something almost mathematical pulling at your brain, as if the layout is trying to say something, but the syntax is gone. A whisper in a language no one speaks anymore. Some have tried to connect the mound arrangement to constellations, suggesting that the circles map out the stars. But those alignments are always tenuous, shifting with latitude, epoch, and the imagination of the viewer. Besides, if the stars were the guide, why not build on a hill? Why not aim them skyward? Instead, the circles sit low, as if they were built for the earth itself, as if they weren't meant to be looked at, but from. Or perhaps they weren't meant to be seen at all, only felt. And that's the strange comfort Wolf Plains offers. You don't leave with answers. You leave with questions in the shape of circles, repeating, reverberating, multiplying. And just when you think Ohio's prehistoric architects couldn't get any more obsessed with perfection, you arrive at a site that looks like geometry made manifest. A ritual playground of circles and squares arranged in such exact proportions that modern engineers still blink at the measurements. Because up next, we head to Eddy, where someone built a sacred circuit board out of soil and then walked away without a single note explaining why. Eddy enclosures perfect square and circles. Just outside the town of Lancaster, Ohio, tucked into the fields of Fairfield County, stands a site so mathematically precise, so flawlessly composed, that it might as well have been laser cut. But it wasn't. It was built likely by hand, basket by basket, breath by breath, more than 2,000 years ago. This is the Eddy enclosure, and it is a study in geometrical obsession. A perfect square, connected to two adjacent circles, all formed from raised earthen embankments that still defy erosion, logic, and full explanation. The square alone measures a near-exact 400 feet per side, aligned not randomly, but with chilling accuracy to the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west. The two attached circles, also composed of embankments, complete the triadic structure. Together, they seem to form a ceremonial space, but the purpose, like always, remains deliberately withheld by time. It's not just the precision that disturbs, it's the implication of intention. Someone didn't just eyeball this. They planned it, surveyed it, marked it, and executed it with such architectural integrity that even modern archaeologists squint at the aerial photos and ask, how? There are no signs of defense, no protective moats, no encampments, no central burial mounds in the square, no evidence of long-term living. The earthworks were not walls in the traditional sense, they were boundaries of meaning, thresholds of space that turned open land into sacred terrain. This wasn't built to keep things out. It was built to frame something invisible. And here's where it gets more interesting. The geometry of the Eddy site follows principles consistent with Hopewell design ideology, which often played with proportions, symmetry, and cosmological alignment. There's something eerily symbolic about the square, the embodiment of stability, structure, and human ordering of the world, and the circles, cycles, eternity, the cosmos, the unknowable. Straight edges meeting curves, man trying to commune with mystery. Some theorists have suggested that the structure served as a kind of ritual calendar, with the alignments of the walls and gateways marking solstices, equinoxes, or moon phases. Others believe it was a sacred blueprint, a map of beliefs rendered in topography, a performance space for a civilization that measured significance not in buildings or weapons, but in the careful placement of dirt. Eddy might have hosted ritual processions, maybe initiations, maybe meetings between communities, or maybe it was never populated at all. Maybe it was a ceremonial diagram meant to be walked, not used. And of course, there's the nagging question, why here? The site isn't on a river. It doesn't command a dramatic view. It's in a field flat, unassuming, almost anonymous. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't meant to dominate the landscape, but to transform it, to take ordinary space and make it sacred by shaping it, by imprinting geometry where chaos used to be. Even the soil here tells stories. Layers of carefully compacted earth, probably moved from miles around, suggesting not just effort, but collaboration. This wasn't one person's vision, it was a community's consensus, a labor of belief, etched into the land like an open-ended prayer. What remains today is only the outline. Much of the original design is gone, eroded or lost to development, but enough survives to feel the pattern. You can still stand at one corner of the square and look across to the other, realizing that these measurements were not accidental, they were decisions, and that turns the site into something more than archaeology. It becomes an unsolvable riddle, dressed as a map. And as you leave the Eddy enclosure, the question lingers in your mind like a persistent echo. What kind of culture centers its most sacred architecture around empty shapes? Because if the square is a room, it has no door. If the circle is a symbol, it holds no text. They offer nothing except form, and somehow, that's everything. But just as you're beginning to make peace with Ohio's obsession with squares and circles, something else catches your attention. A cross, carved not in stone, not in wood, but in earth, quietly resting near a modern highway, as if trying not to draw attention to itself. No graves, no scripture. Just a raised cross, alone in the landscape. And not one person can say for sure what it was ever meant to mark. Tarlton Cross Mound. Drive just a few minutes outside the small village of Tarlton, Ohio, and you'll come across a subtle rise in the ground, almost easy to miss unless you know where to look. No towering walls, no dramatic view, no surrounding complex, just an elongated cross carved into the earth itself. It's called the Tarlton Cross Mound, and it sits quietly on a grassy hill like the forgotten punctuation mark of a sentence no one remembers writing. It's not large, about 90 feet long in each arm of the cross, forming a symmetrical plus sign raised slightly above the natural grade. The lines are made of earth, not stone. They're not defensive. They're not for burial, and they don't appear to contain artifacts in any significant number. Which leaves us with the central question that threads through nearly every prehistoric structure in Ohio. Why would anyone build this? Let's start with what it isn't. Despite its shape, it has no connection to Christianity. The cross, as we understand it in a religious sense, was nowhere near the cultural vocabulary of the builders. This predates European contact by over 1,000 years. The symbol we now associate with crucifixion in churches had, in this context, entirely different connotations, if it was meant to represent anything at all. So what was the cross shape meant to convey? One interpretation is that it represents the four cardinal directions north, south, east, west, making the mound a kind of cosmic compass or orientation marker. This would align with known Hopewell and Eddy practices, which often emphasized astronomical directions in their construction. If you stood in the center of the cross, you might have been standing at the symbolic center of the world, or at least a world, their world. Another theory suggests the shape is a symbolic intersection, a meeting place between realms, earth and sky, physical and spiritual, human and divine. In this reading, the mound isn't just a shape, it's a portal, a liminal zone where movement between planes was possible, or at least mimicked. Rituals might have been performed there, not for spectacle, but for transformation. Quiet ceremonies aimed not outward, but inward. Still others see the cross as a kind of calendar or time marker. The arms may align to significant solar events, solstices, equinoxes, or even lunar positions, acting as a functional instrument for tracking sacred time. In this interpretation, the cross isn't a symbol at all, but a tool. One that you don't look at, but walk upon. But here's the twist. There's a ditch surrounding three sides of the cross. Not deep, not imposing, but clearly intentional. It's like a protective moat, but with one arm left open. This design has baffled researchers. Why leave one side exposed? Was it meant to guide entry into the site, directing visitors to enter from a specific direction, perhaps at sunrise, or moonrise, or seasonally determined points? It's easy to assume the cross was meant to be seen from above. From a modern drone's perspective, it's a striking image, elegant in its simplicity. But of course, no one 2,000 years ago had access to aerial views. This begs the deeper question. Who was the audience? Was it meant for the gods? For sky spirits? For something watching from above? Or was the act of building it the point? Maybe no one needed to see it to understand it. Maybe walking the arms of the cross north to south, east to west was itself the ritual. A ceremonial mapping of identity, or a rehearsal of cosmic balance. Every step, a movement through sacred space. What's especially eerie is how alone it is. Most of Ohio's ancient mounds are part of complexes, circles, squares, corridors, burial sites, all working in concert. But the Tarlton Cross Mound stands apart, isolated, self-contained. There's no nearby geometry, no accompanying village site, no obvious infrastructure. It's just there. A singular statement, built from dirt and silence. And yet, it's preserved, still intact, still visible. The world has built up around it, roads, fences, power lines, but the cross remains untouched, a quiet survivor of a language we no longer speak. Maybe that's its point, to endure, not to explain. Because sometimes, mystery is the entire function. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a space to be held. A gesture that reminds us how little we truly know about what mattered to the people who came before. And if this cross was a cosmic axis, a point where space and time intersected, then what happens when we descend from this quiet geometry back into the world of monumental mounds? Giant cones of earth, towering over the landscape, concealing their purpose in sheer mass. Because what comes next is one of the largest conical mounds in North America, and nobody has looked inside. Miamisburg Mound's hidden core. You can see it from the highway, looming above the rooftops and trees, like a prehistoric punctuation mark. The Miamisburg Mound, a 65-foot tall, 877-foot circumference behemoth of dirt, dominates the surrounding landscape in Montgomery County, Ohio. It's one of the largest conical burial mounds in North America, larger than many buildings, taller than most three-story houses, and yet, for all its presence and permanence, it keeps one enormous secret. We've barely looked inside. Built by the Eddy culture, likely over 2,000 years ago, the mound was constructed in layers, dirt stacked upon dirt, ringed and packed, rising upward in a deliberate cone that seems to point toward the sky. But what lies at the center? What was the purpose? And what, if anything, was interred there? We're still not sure, because despite a 19th century excavation attempt and despite centuries of speculation, the mound remains largely unexamined. That's not an oversight, it's a decision. One part respect, one part caution, and one part unresolved fear that the answers, once revealed, might be less clear than the questions. Let's go back to that 1869 excavation attempt. An early team of diggers tunneled horizontally into the side of the mound. What they found was inconclusive. Some stone layers, a few tools, a hint of a wooden platform, but no central burial chamber, no ceremonial cache, no dramatic discovery. The tunnel was eventually sealed, and the mound was left mostly undisturbed. Since then, Miamisburg has stood as a kind of monument to unknowns. Unlike some smaller Eddy mounds where cremated remains, grave goods, or ceremonial structures have been uncovered, this one remains opaque, a sealed vault of soil and silence. Modern technology like ground-penetrating radar could, in theory, peer inside. But even that has been used sparingly. The mystery is preserved by non-interference, as if opening it would somehow lessen its meaning. But what is that meaning? A mound like Miamisburg wasn't a casual construction. It required thousands of labor hours, generations of planning, and a cultural consensus that this shape, on this hill, meant something sacred. The size alone implies status either of the person buried within, or the community who built it. Possibly both. Some speculate it was the burial site of a great leader, a religious figure, or perhaps a symbolic ancestor, an embodiment of a tribe's origin story. But if that's true, then why no central chamber? Maybe we're thinking too literally. Maybe the mound itself was the burial. A ritualized piling of earth meant to honor a person or idea without enclosing it. A monument to memory, rather than remains. Or perhaps it was built in stages, each layer marking a new era, a new event, or a return pilgrimage to honor something or someone already long gone. There's also the possibility that the mound had an astronomical purpose. Its shape and location might have allowed it to function as a seasonal marker, with shadow lines, sunrise alignments, or other celestial phenomena woven into its very form. The conical shape could have acted as a kind of gnomon, a sundial of dirt marking time not just in days, but in generations. Then there's the symbolic architecture of height. To build upward, especially with no practical reason, is to reach, to aspire, to raise something from the earth toward the sky. Miamisburg Mound isn't just tall. It's elevated in a metaphysical sense, a stair-step for the soul, a monument to transition. But what happens if we never open it? What does it mean to preserve a monument whose contents remain unknown? Is the mound's power rooted in its secrecy? Would excavation collapse its mystique? Or is the act of not knowing the most sacred posture we can take toward it? There's something beautifully frustrating about standing at the base of Miamisburg. You can walk the spiraling path to the top recently built for tourists, not ancients, and look out across the Ohio landscape. But no matter how high you climb, the central question always remains below you. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes the truth isn't buried. It's built, layered with time, packed with intention, and sealed beneath the weight of reverence and willful ignorance. The Eddy may not have wanted us to open the mound. They may have wanted us to respect the silhouette to see the shape, not the bones. But if Miamisburg is a sealed vault, Ohio has another one just down the road, another towering cone of earth, nearly its equal in size, still unopened, still unknown. And yet, despite its size, this next mound doesn't even get a full tourist sign, just a name, just a bump on the prairie. And absolutely no explanation. Enon, Knob Prairie, Mound's purpose. Just west of the quiet village of Enon, Ohio, there rises a grassy hill, too symmetrical to be natural, too forgotten to be famous. It stands unceremoniously at the edge of a town park, across from fast food signs and paved roads, which is either ironic or poetic, depending on how generous you're feeling. Locals know it simply as the Enon Mound, or sometimes the Knob Prairie Mound, a title so subdued it almost apologizes for being interesting. But don't be fooled. This is the second largest conical burial mound in Ohio, and it holds exactly the same number of confirmed answers as its larger sibling in Miamisburg. 0. Measured at roughly 40 feet high and 125 feet across, Enon Mound is a giant among ancient constructions. Like Miamisburg, it's traditionally attributed to the Eddy culture, and like Miamisburg, it remains largely unexcavated. There are no clear records of burials retrieved, no major artifact discoveries, no known chambers breached, just a massive pile of ancient earth, holding its tongue for over 2 millennia. Which raises the obvious question, why does nobody seem to talk about this one? Maybe because it's overshadowed. Miamisburg gets the headlines, the Serpent Mound gets the t-shirts, Newark gets the drone footage, Enon, by contrast, just sits there, patient, muted, monumental in size but nearly invisible in conversation. It's the kind of place people drive past every day without realizing they're skirting the edge of something built by hands, long vanished, using a purpose long erased. But that doesn't mean the purpose didn't exist. In fact, the more you look at it, the more deliberate it becomes. The mound is nearly perfectly round. Its slope is even. Its summit remains undisturbed, not by modern structures, not by archaeologists, not even by the temptations of curiosity. This isn't just neglect, it's restraint. Whether by design or by disinterest, the Enon Mound has remained intact, making it one of the best preserved ancient mounds of its kind. So what's inside? Maybe nothing? Maybe ashes? Maybe a central log tomb, as is typical of Eddy mortuary practice. Maybe something rare, like carved stone pipes or copper tools. Or maybe something far less tangible, a cosmic anchor, a marker of spiritual geography rather than burial logistics. Some theories suggest that mounds like Enon were not just tombs, but monuments to status constructed not simply to honor the dead, but to elevate them, literally. The act of building upward wasn't just architectural, it was metaphysical. The higher the mound, the closer the spirit got to the sky, the stars, the beyond. If that's the case, then Enon wasn't built to store a body. It was built to launch a soul. Others argue the mound could have served as a territorial marker, staking out sacred or social boundaries visible from miles away. In a world without maps, what better way to declare presence than a 40-foot hill that shouldn't be there? But then you have to ask, why build it here? The site isn't part of a larger earthwork complex. There's no accompanying square, circle, or embankment, no known procession route. Just one massive, lonely mound on a rise in the landscape positioned in such a way that it would have been visible for miles before the modern tree line grew in. That isolation itself might be meaningful. Some believe the Enon Mound could represent a solitary sacred function, reserved for a single individual or a unique ceremonial act. Perhaps a burial of someone whose social or religious significance required distance from the rest, not rejection, but reverence through solitude. A spiritual quarantine that elevated, protected, and contained. And yet, the absence of excavation leaves us swimming in speculation. We don't know what's at the center. We don't know if there was a platform underneath. We don't know what was placed with the dead, if anything. And we don't know what rituals were performed here, if any at all. But perhaps that's the enduring power of Enon. It resists interpretation. It offers nothing but shape and silence. And in that silence, there's a kind of eloquence, A reminder that some monuments weren't built to communicate with the future. They were built to fulfill a purpose in the moment, for the people who made them in a language we can no longer read. In a sense, the Enon Mound functions like a prehistoric black box. The structure remains. The contents are sealed. The context is gone. But the fact that it's still here, untouched, unbroken, unclaimed, makes it more than just an artifact. It's a relic of restraint. And as you stand at its base, squinting up at its grass-covered slope, you get the feeling that it's watching you back. Not with menace, not even with judgment, just with patience. Because if Enon is quiet, what comes next is even quieter. A flat rock, etched with images no one can decode, weathered by rain, waves, and centuries of interpretive failure. And this next mystery isn't a mound, it's a message. And it's vanishing. Inscription. Rock. Kelly's Island. On the northern edge of Kelly's Island, surrounded by the soft hiss of Lake Erie and the occasional screech of a gull too nosy for its own good, lies a boulder. Not a particularly tall one, not especially grand, but strange enough to be wrapped in a protective shelter, fenced off like a stubborn whisper, and labeled with a name both vague and hopeful. Inscription. Rock. It's a slab of limestone, weathered smooth by glacial ice thousands of years ago, and it carries etched into its surface more than 100 figures, animals, birds, symbols, and humanoid forms. They're not letters, they're not runes, they're petroglyphs, painstakingly pecked or carved into the rock by hands long gone, and to this day, no one agrees on when it was made, why, or by whom. Inscription. Rock is easy to overlook. It's not elevated like a mound, or geometrically overwhelming like Newark. It doesn't announce itself. In fact, many people stumble upon it by accident, assuming it's just another interpretive plaque from a local historical society. But once you get close, you realize this is a message from the past, one that was never translated. Some archaeologists tentatively date it to the late prehistoric period, possibly attributed to the late woodland or fort ancient cultures. Others argue it might be even older. But the truth is, there's no consensus. Radiocarbon dating doesn't work on stone. There's no accompanying settlement nearby, no artifacts embedded in the petroglyphs. Just the rock, the water, and the figures some half erased by centuries of freezing, thawing, and slow erosion by wind and lake spray. So what do the carvings depict? That depends on who you ask. Some figures look unmistakably like birds, wings outstretched, frozen mid-flight. Others resemble deer, or perhaps elk animals with antlers and long, lean bodies. A few seem to be humanoid stick figure-like, abstract but intentional. There are also abstract forms, spirals, circles, and motifs that might represent celestial bodies or concepts lost to time. The images are crowded together, sometimes overlapping, like thoughts spoken aloud all at once. Are they a story? A map? A set of symbols passed down through generations like a sacred graffiti wall? One theory suggests the petroglyphs are a record of vision quests, spiritual journeys undertaken by individuals whose experiences were memorialized in images carved onto sacred stone. Each figure, then, might represent an encounter, a spirit animal, a dream, a divine messenger. In this interpretation, Inscription rock becomes a kind of spiritual ledger where transcendence was recorded in code. Another theory holds that the rock served a community function, perhaps as a gathering point, a place where stories, alliances, or ritual obligations were marked into the landscape. The location, just steps from the waterline, may have held significance, a threshold between land and lake, between permanence and transience, a place where messages could be left, but not guaranteed to remain. Because that's the dark twist to this story. Inscription, rock is disappearing, The carvings, once much deeper and more defined, have faded dramatically over the past century. Early documentation from the 1802 includes sketches of dozens of figures that are no longer visible. Erosion has been merciless. Salt and spray, ice and algae, heat and time, they're all working in concert to wipe the rock clean, like nature is reclaiming the message, syllable by syllable. There are other petroglyphs around the Great Lakes region, but few with this density, and fewer still in such a vulnerable position. Kelly's Island isn't hostile, but it is exposed. And the rock, as immovable as it seems, is vulnerable to the very forces it once withstood. This has sparked debate. Should the rock be moved, preserved in a museum, scanned with lasers and reproduced? Or should it be allowed to vanish, as perhaps the carvers intended a message made for the present moment of its time, never meant to endure? And deeper still, what if we're not meant to understand it? Modern minds itch to decode, to translate, to make sense of the past using our current languages and frameworks. But Inscription rock defies that. It doesn't offer an alphabet. It doesn't match any known sequence. It's a song sung in a dialect that vanished before contact. We're reading it like a book, when maybe it was meant to be felt, walked around, touched, cried in front of, or passed silently with reverence. The fence around it keeps us back. But maybe it's also a reminder that some messages weren't meant for everyone. Maybe the meaning isn't in what's left on the rock, but in what's already been taken away. And just when you think ancient Ohio couldn't get more cryptic, the next site confronts you with more carvings, this time on a sandstone cliff, farther inland, higher above the waterline. Figures, symbols, footprints carved into the earth. Another mystery with no Rosetta Stone, only the sense that someone was here and that they had something to say. Leo, petroglyphs. Tucked into the forest near the unassuming hamlet of Zaleski, Ohio, lies a sandstone cliff face that has endured thousands of seasons, each one chiseling it a little smoother, softening its edges, and erasing just enough of its secrets to make the rest unbearable. This is the Leo petroglyph site, a natural platform etched with over 30 figures, some animals, some human-like, and all united by one unnerving truth. No one really knows what they mean. Unlike Inscription rock, which sits just above the waters of Lake Erie, Leo is perched well inland, far from any major body of water, and all the more eerie for it. There's no open vista, no great view. It doesn't demand attention with scale or drama. In fact, you could stumble right past it on a casual walk in the woods and assume the markings are the product of idle hands and weathered stone. But step closer, and the carvings begin to emerge, figures you can't quite categorize, arranged in no obvious sequence. 4-toed footprints, a long-tailed feline with an impossibly curved spine, a bird, a fish, a series of strange indentations and abstract shapes that defy description. It's a kind of prehistoric comic strip carved into the ground, but with no text, no captions, and no clear beginning or end. Dating the petroglyphs is a lesson in educated guessing. Most scholars cautiously place them in the late prehistoric period, often linking them to the Fort Ancient culture, though no direct artifacts tie the site to a specific group. There's no habitation layer beneath the carvings, no burial mounds nearby, no charnel house debris, just a stone slab, carved with inexplicable care. This is where interpretation becomes a minefield. Are these images narrative, like chapters in a myth passed down orally until finally recorded in stone? Or are they symbolic, each one representing a spiritual figure, clan emblem, or vision experience? Were they meant to be seen as a whole or individually, like a patchwork of sacred graffiti? Let's start with the footprints, arguably the most unsettling elements on the rock. They're not anatomically correct. Some have too few toes, others are too elongated. But what's striking is that they're human-like, unmistakably intended to echo us. They could represent spirits, gods, ancestors, or the shamanic presence of someone who left their mark in a space between worlds. But they don't go anywhere. They don't lead. They don't walk. They're frozen in time, as if the act of standing still held more spiritual weight than the act of moving forward. Then there's the cat-like creature, a large animal with a looping tail and abstract body proportions. It has been variously interpreted as a panther, a dog, or a mythic beast. Some believe it's another representation of the underwater panther, a symbol of chaos and the liminal zone between worlds. If so, then Leo isn't just a carving site, it's a cosmic crossroads, a slab where opposites, water and land, life and death, known and unknown meet. There are also avian figures, possibly representing the thunderbirds of Algonquian mythologies, locked in eternal combat with the panther below. The rock, then, becomes a battleground. Not literal, but cosmological, a metaphysical wrestling match between order and entropy, sky and underworld. And still others see something far more grounded. Some argue the petroglyphs were used for teaching visual aids in ceremonial storytelling, maybe even initiation rituals. A shaman could point to each figure, recount the myth, and pass the sacred narrative down to the next generation. But perhaps the most haunting theory is the simplest, that the carvings were deeply personal. Vision experiences, dream records. No audience, no narrative structure, just one person carving out what they saw during a spiritual trance. If that's true, then Leo is less like a book and more like a diary with 30 authors and no translation. And then there's the matter of preservation. The petroglyphs have suffered from erosion, vandalism, and the slow decay of unprotected stone. Some figures are faint, barely distinguishable from the natural striations in the rock. A shelter has since been built to protect them from the worst of the elements, but time, as always, has already taken its toll. It's an uncomfortable truth. For all our satellites, lasers, and scanning tech, we still can't read this place. Not properly, not respectfully. We can guess, we can categorize, but we can't know, because whatever was spoken here wasn't meant for us. It wasn't carved for permanence. It wasn't explained because explanation was never the point. And maybe that's the legacy of the Leo petroglyphs, a permanent record of impermanent meaning, a message you can see with your eyes, but never touch with your mind. Ohio's silent mythology, written on stone and fading by design. But for all their silence, the Leo petroglyphs hint at something older still, something from a time before petroglyphs, before mounds, before geometric earthworks and ceremonial alignments. The first people to ever walk this land, hunters, wanderers, and fire makers who left behind not images, but stone tools, scattered across what would one day be Ohio. Because what comes next isn't about ceremony or story, it's about survival. And it begins in the Ice Age. Paleo crossing site, Medina County. Before the serpent uncoiled, before the Hopewell traced lunar alignments into the dirt, before the Eddy raised mounds like punctuation marks on the Ohio horizon, there was something else. Someone else. A hunter, maybe. A wanderer. Someone with a flint spear point and a mind full of stars and ice. Someone whose entire life was movement because the earth hadn't settled yet. The trees weren't even all there. And the glaciers? Still melting, still pulling back the veil from a continent not yet home to stories, but to survival. This is the deep prehistory of Ohio. And at the center of it sits one of the oldest human habitation sites in the state, the Paleo Crossing Site, located in Medina County, northeast Ohio. A place that predates every earthwork, every petroglyph, every conical mound you've seen on a postcard or highway sign. A place that doesn't speak in symbols or ceremonies, but in stone tools, broken bones, and the echo of ancient footsteps. Discovered in the late 20th century, Paleo Crossing represents a rare glimpse into the Paleo-Indian period, the earliest known human presence in what would eventually be called Ohio. The people who passed through here are associated with what archaeologists call the Clovis culture, famous for their fluted projectile points, mobile lifestyle, and eerie ability to appear suddenly across massive stretches of North America around 13,000 years ago. Think about that. Not just long ago, but glacially long ago. The megafauna were still around: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and the people, they were few. Tiny bands moving across raw, wild landscapes where rivers had no names and forests had no borders. And yet, they left traces. At Paleo Crossing, those traces take the form of stone, mostly flint, painstakingly worked into sharp, efficient tools: projectile points, scrapers, cores. What's especially compelling is that the flint didn't all come from Medina County. In fact, some of it was sourced from hundreds of miles away, which means these people were moving a lot, and not aimlessly. The flint types recovered at the site include material from places like Flint Ridge in central Ohio and beyond. That suggests a kind of network, not roads, not cities, but a knowledge of the land and its resources that was intimate, ancestral, and somehow shared. Either people were trading, or they were walking astonishing distances in seasonal circuits, migrating across vast expanses of Ice Age wilderness. So what does that say about the site itself? Paleo Crossing doesn't show evidence of a permanent settlement. It wasn't a town, or even a village. More likely, it was a stopping point, a temporary camp used by a small group of people as they hunted, foraged, and regrouped. A seasonal hub, possibly used and reused for generations. A place to rest, shape tools, plan the next move. But here's the part that doesn't add up. The flint points found here are Clovis style, but there's evidence, radiocarbon and stratigraphic, that the site might be older than other Clovis sites. Some researchers have proposed that Paleo Crossing could be among the earliest in the eastern United States. If true, it raises uncomfortable questions about where these people came from and how they got here. The old model had humans arriving in the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge, moving south through an ice-free corridor around 12,000 years ago. But Paleo Crossing and other sites like it suggest that people might have been in this region earlier than that, when the glaciers were still locking up parts of the continent like a cosmic do not enter sign. So how did they get here? By boat? Along the coast? Through forgotten routes across the ice? No one knows. The timeline doesn't behave. The artifacts don't obey. And the deeper you dig into Paleo Crossing, the more it feels like Ohio's own origin riddle, a prehistoric footnote written in Flint and misplaced in the archaeological index. And then there's the emotional part. These weren't ghosts. These were people. They had names we'll never know, languages we'll never recover, relationships, jokes, fears. They lived in a world where fire was life, and the horizon was an unmarked boundary between known and unknown. And yet, they stood where you stand now. Walk across the site if you could, and you'd be stepping into their shadow. Not metaphorically, literally. You'd be placing your feet into the same ground, under the same sky, on the same earth, where someone once paused to nap, sharpen a point, or dream of something better. The past doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it just waits under layers of dirt, beneath our certainty, right at the edge of what we think we know. And just a few counties over, another site offers more than just tools. It offers gathering, a place where people may have returned again and again, not just to survive, but to connect, to share, to be together beneath the flint-colored sky. Welling Site, Coshocton County. If the Paleo Crossing site speaks to a time of movement, of solitary survival, of darting through Ice Age woods with flint and fire, then the Welling Site, located in Coshocton County, whispers a different kind of story. A slower one, a gathering one. Less sprint, more orbit. Less solitude, more smoke curling from multiple campfires in the dark. It tells of a world where people didn't just move through the land, they came back to it. again and again, for generations. Welling sits near the headwaters of the Walhonding River, nestled into what is now farmland and wooded hills. To the casual eye, it's nothing. Another patch of Ohio soil with no visible scars. But buried beneath are layers upon layers of ancient human activity. Stone tools, fire pits, flakes of flint so small they seem accidental, yet add up to a presence that refuses to vanish. This was not a one-time stopover. The Welling site appears to have been a base camp, a repeated-use location tied to the Clovis tradition, just like Paleo Crossing. But the depth and density of material here tell us something else. This wasn't just a place where someone passed through. It was a place where people stayed, returned, and possibly gathered in larger numbers than most Paleo-Indian sites ever suggest. And the Flint? Oh, the Flint. Welling is parked right in the middle of a prehistoric treasure chest, near one of the most significant flint sources in North America. Coshocton County sits on the edge of what would become known as Flint Ridge, a region of high-quality, colorful, knappable stone that ancient people recognized, valued, and transported across hundreds of miles. At Welling, the flint isn't just used, it's everywhere. Waste flakes from tool production lie in heaps, broken points, preforms, scrapers, cores. This wasn't a place where tools were casually shaped. It was a manufacturing hub, a kind of prehistoric workshop where stone was shaped into precision and precision into survival. But here's where the story curves into mystery. How many people were there? How long did they stay? And what were they doing besides making tools? There are clues, hearth remnants, concentrations of activity, layers of soil marked by successive occupations. Some researchers believe the site may have seen seasonal use, with groups returning year after year during certain times, perhaps in late summer or early fall, when game was plentiful and river levels were low. Others suspect the site may have been intergenerational, a place known to ancestors and passed down through stories, memory, and migration. This is where interpretation starts to wobble. Was Welling a gathering point? A crossroads where families met, shared news, conducted marriages, or buried their dead? We don't have ceremonial mounds or overt signs of ritual here. No effigies or carvings, but maybe that's the point. Maybe in the Clovis world, every act was sacred and no permanent monument was needed. Just the return itself, the knowledge that this place held warmth, flint, food, and people you knew. Welling may have operated like a social magnet. Even before the mound builders etched geometry into Ohio's soil, there were already places pulling people together. And here's what makes that idea unsettling in the best way. If people gathered here regularly, that suggests not just survival, but culture, community, identity. They weren't just making tools, they were likely making relationships, sharing meals, teaching the young how to knap stone, swapping stories about dangerous hunts or close calls with the cold. Laughing, probably. Grieving, certainly. But then the Ice Age faded. The world changed. Forests took over, rivers shifted, and people moved on. Welling became quieter, its fires extinguished, its artifacts buried by time and silt. But the layers remain, thick with debris and intention. Every flake of flint is a decision. Every scatter pattern is a silent voice. There's no writing, no petroglyphs, but the density of presence speaks louder than any symbol ever could. Even now, when archaeologists return to excavate, they often find more than expected. The site expands, the activity zones widen, and with every new trench, a bigger picture emerges, one not of isolated wanderers, but of people who remembered, who returned, who honored a piece of land not for its mystery, but for its reliability. Welling isn't ceremonial, it's not monumental. It doesn't try to impress you. It just was for a very long time. And that quiet persistence is its most profound offering. Because while Welling was about staying, The next site was about extraction, not gathering people, but gathering stone, not forming bonds, but forging networks. Trade, travel, and a spiritual economy built on what lay just underfoot. And what lay underfoot was flint, not just any flint. The flint from the ridge that once fed half a continent. Flint Ridge, ancient quarries. Somewhere along the rolling hills of eastern Licking and western Muskingum counties lies a stretch of land so rich in prehistory, it might as well be sacred ground. Not for its mounds, not for its geometry, not for its rituals, but for what it provided. This is Flint Ridge, a narrow band of high-quality flint, so dense, so uniquely patterned, so unmistakable in color and quality, that it became the literal bedrock of an ancient trade network spanning half the continent. For thousands of years, people came here not to bury the dead or to worship the sky, but to dig, to cut into the ground, to quarry out the one material that seemed to transcend every tribal boundary, stone sharp enough to shape survival. But this wasn't just any stone. Flint Ridge is known for its dazzling variety of hues, pinks, yellows, creams, even purples. It fractures cleanly, sharpens precisely, and sparkles in the sun with a kind of mineral defiance. The indigenous peoples who first discovered it didn't just use it, they understood it, revered it, and built entire logistical systems around it. And the scale? Staggering. Flint Ridge stretches about 8 miles long and 1 to 2 miles wide, with dozens of quarry pits found along its length. Some pits are shallow, some deep. All were dug without metal tools, using stone mauls, antler picks, and muscle. Thousands of pounds of flint were extracted here over millennia, one chunk at a time, by people who understood not just where to dig, but how. What's remarkable is how old this activity is. Evidence suggests that people began quarrying Flint Ridge as far back as the Paleo-Indian period, right around the time of the Welling and Paleo crossing sites. And yet, the usage persisted for thousands of years, across cultural shifts, language groups, and even technological revolutions. The Eddy used it, the Hopewell revered it, later cultures traded it. And flint from this exact ridge has been found hundreds of miles away, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and even Ontario. Which raises an essential question. How? How did a quarry in central Ohio become a continental supplier of stone? Some believe it was pilgrimage. People from distant regions may have traveled to Flint Ridge for the material itself, not just for its utility, but for its spiritual or symbolic weight. Others argue that exchange networks were already flourishing in prehistory, and Flint Ridge flint moved through hands like currency, exchanged at ceremonial gatherings, festivals, or alliances. And here's where things get stranger. Many artifacts, made from Flint Ridge stone, are not weapons. They're pipes, beads, figurines, ritual blades, in other words, sacred objects. Flint here wasn't just for hunting, it was for meaning, for expression, for identity. The stone wasn't neutral. It carried something aesthetic, spiritual, social, that made it worth the trip. Even its appearance supports this. Some Flint Ridge flint has a translucent, gem-like quality. It doesn't just function, it glows. Objects carved from it were likely not hidden but displayed, worn, or offered in ritual settings, which makes the act of quarrying it even more fascinating. Because quarrying, by all accounts, wasn't casual. You don't dig into sacred land with indifference. You don't haul stone up from the earth's body without intent. Many believe that the process of extraction was ritualized, that before the digging began, ceremonies were performed, prayers were said, tobacco was offered, songs were sung. In some traditions, even today, the earth is treated as a living being, and removing anything from it, especially something as potent as Flint Ridge stone, requires permission. So the quarry pit becomes more than a hole in the ground. It becomes a dialogue, a space where humans asked the earth for help, and the earth, at least for a time, said yes. Then there's the act of shaping the flint. Once removed, it had to be processed, hammered, flaked, knapped into useful or symbolic forms. This, too, required skill, precision, tradition. Every scrape of stone against stone was a learned motion, passed down, perfected. And because each piece of flint is unique, each artifact carried the fingerprint of its maker unwritten, but legible to those who knew how to read it. What remains today at Flint Ridge are shallow depressions, scattered debris, and a lingering sense of purpose. The deeper pits have collapsed or been filled, trees have grown over the scars. But if you stand quietly, especially in the early morning when the fog clings low and the birds hold their breath, you can still feel it, the rhythm of tools, the low murmur of voices, the reverence of labor that knew it was part of something larger. And that's the paradox of Flint Ridge. It's not a mystery in the usual sense. We know what they did here. We know how they did it. The mystery lies in the value in why this stone mattered so much, to so many for so long, and what it meant to take it from the earth. Because this wasn't just resource extraction. It was participation in a spiritual economy, one that valued not just the object, but the origin. And in some cases, that origin didn't stop at the soil. Because next comes a riddle stranger than any quarry, mound, or petroglyph. Stone shaped not by hand, but by the sky. Metal that didn't come from earth at all. Meteoritic iron in Hopewell, Ohio. If you've spent enough time with Ohio's prehistoric mysteries, you start to notice a pattern. Earthworks shaped like geometry-class nightmares. Mounds built without metal, yet with surgical precision. Flint carved into gods and given to the dead. But every so often, something appears that doesn't fit the pattern. Something that doesn't just defy explanation, it defies the planet. That something is meteoritic iron. Yes, iron from space. Scattered across several Hopewell sites, particularly in central and southern Ohio, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts made from meteoritic iron, not smelted, not mined, not forged in a furnace. These objects were hammered cold, worked with careful skill, and shaped into beads, blades, and other items of ceremonial importance. And here's the twist. The Hopewell people didn't have the technology to make iron. They didn't melt it, purify it, or extract it from ore. That wasn't part of their world. So how did they work with iron at all? Because it fell from the sky. Meteoritic iron is different from terrestrial iron. It's formed in space, under unimaginable pressures and temperatures, and carried to Earth aboard meteorites, chunks of cosmic debris that crash through the atmosphere and explode into our world with all the grace of a falling god. These meteorites often contain a mix of iron and nickel, and this composition makes them chemically distinct from earth-forged metal. That's how we know the Hopewell didn't fake it. The objects they left behind, some discovered in burial mounds, others in sacred caches, have been chemically analyzed. The verdict is consistent. The metal came from meteoritic sources, likely from known falls such as the Brenham or Anoka meteorites, or perhaps even undiscovered ones. Some pieces may have been traded from as far west as the Great Plains. Let that sink in. People living in Ohio 2,000 years ago were collecting iron that originated in space, shaping it with stone tools and placing it in tombs. Not for utility, not for combat, but for ritual. And that's where the mystery deepens. What did meteoritic iron mean to the Hopewell? There are no written texts, no oral traditions that survive intact, no carved instruction manuals or pictographic legends about sky rocks. But if you imagine the world through Hopewell eyes, where mounds align with stars and lunar cycles choreograph ceremonies, the sudden arrival of a glowing rock from the heavens would be hard to ignore. It would be a message. A rupture in the sky. A physical piece of the divine. To possess that object would be to hold something outside time, not born of the earth, not subject to decay or normal rules. Just imagine how it might have looked when found. Strange, dense, magnetic, resistant to fire, and yet workable. The Hopewell likely shaped it using techniques similar to their stone crafting, cold hammering, pecking, polishing, no melting, no forging, just patience and power. Beads of meteoritic iron have been discovered alongside other elite grave goods: obsidian from the Yellowstone area, mica from the Appalachians, copper from the Great Lakes. These weren't everyday tools. They were items of power and prestige, or perhaps more than that. Talismans. If flint was the tool of survival, and copper was the metal of ritual, then meteoritic iron was the material of cosmic significance. To wear it was to connect to the sky. To be buried with it was to ensure a celestial escort into whatever came after. And yet, despite the drama of these implications, the actual artifacts are often humble in form. Small, simple, understated. As if the Hopewell understood something we often forget, that the origin of a thing can matter more than its appearance. These weren't showpieces, they were charged. And here's the moral paradox, the quiet reversal. Today, we can identify exactly where these meteorites came from. We know their elemental ratios, their cosmic history, their impact zones. We can trace them with scientific clarity, but we still don't know what they meant. Because we're standing outside the belief system, we see the iron, but not the awe. We analyze the beads, but we can't recreate the ceremony where they were last held. We can detect the celestial origin of the metal, but not the emotional gravity it had when it fell flaming from the sky, onto a land that hadn't asked for it, but knew enough to listen. And this is where the Hopewell world becomes unnerving in the best way. They weren't just building for the dead, or charting the moon. They were reaching out, making sense of a universe that spoke in alignments, in shadows, in meteors. And sometimes, they answered that universe by trading not ideas, not myths, but matter. Because the next mystery expands the network further. Obsidian from Yellowstone, shells from the Gulf, copper from Michigan, grizzly teeth, panther carvings, pearls, and mica arriving from distances too vast for modern logic, too consistent to be coincidence. It wasn't just Ohio that was sacred. It was a continent-wide conversation, and nobody left behind the transcript. Exotic goods in Ohio mounds. One of the first rules of ancient history, especially in the sanitized versions we learn in school, is that prehistoric people didn't get around much. The past is often painted as a patchwork of isolated tribes, each tied to its local landscape, never straying too far, never dreaming beyond the next valley. But if you dig into the mounds of Ohio, you find something that makes that whole narrative collapse like a poorly built embankment. Because inside these mounds buried beneath layers of clay, charcoal, and silence are objects from far away, very far away. Obsidian from what is now Yellowstone National Park, copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, grizzly bear teeth, quartz crystals, mica sheets the size of playing cards, even shark teeth. None of these things are native to the river valleys and rolling hills of southern Ohio. And yet, they appear again and again within the tombs, caches, and ceremonial centers of the Hopewell culture, which flourished roughly between 100 BCE and 500 CE. The implication isn't just that people were moving these objects, it's that they were moving them on purpose. What does that say about prehistoric Ohio? It says the mounds weren't just tombs or earth sculptures, they were nexus points, terminals in a sprawling, invisible trade network that linked distant ecosystems and far-flung societies across what is now the United States. A cultural constellation, a slow, intentional exchange of symbolic wealth. And make no mistake, this wasn't commerce, not in the modern, transactional sense. This wasn't proto-capitalism. It was something deeper, older, more spiritual. These weren't raw materials for production, they were sacred items, imbued with meaning before they ever reached their final resting places. Let's start with the obsidian. Found in multiple Hopewell sites, particularly the famous burial mounds of the Scioto River Valley, these jet-black volcanic stones have been traced geochemically to sources in the Rocky Mountains, especially around Yellowstone. That's nearly 1,500 miles away. And yet, the obsidian didn't arrive randomly. It was shaped into spear points, blades, and ritual objects. Their edges still sharp, their forms sleek and intentional. They weren't used for hunting, they were buried with the dead. Then there's copper. Large quantities of it show up in Hopewell sites fashioned into breastplates, ear spools, crescent shapes, serpent forms. Much of it came from the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, hundreds of miles to the north. But what's more curious is the form it takes. The copper was not forged, there were no smelting furnaces. It was cold hammered, shaped by hand and stone, retaining its purity. No alloys, no additives. As if the Hopewell wanted the copper to stay as close to its origin as possible. And then we have the seashells, found deep inland, sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest saltwater. They show up in burial contexts, gorgets, beads, and headdresses. Many of them come from the Gulf of Mexico, the Florida coast, Louisiana, the Carolinas, not from trade posts, not from casual travelers. From a system one where sacred goods moved deliberately across tribal boundaries, across languages, across entire world views. What powered this network? Not conquest, not empire, not forced labor or tribute. What we seem to be looking at is a system of ceremonial exchange goods traded not for necessity, but for meaning. Obsidian wasn't a tool, it was a token. Copper wasn't currency, it was symbolism, flattened and shaped into belief. The further it traveled, the more powerful it became. Some archaeologists call this the Hopewell interaction sphere. But that term feels a little too clean, too academic. What we're really looking at is something more akin to a spiritual supply chain. One that didn't just move objects, it moved ideas, stories, rituals. Every carved shell, every polished stone, every bare canine drilled to be worn as a necklace, they weren't just decorations. They were statements, and those statements often culminated in burial. Because many of these exotic goods were not used in daily life. They were buried almost immediately interred with the dead, sometimes broken as if to release their power. As if the act of giving them to the earth was more important than the act of possessing them above ground. This suggests something eerie and fascinating, that the goods weren't meant to stay in circulation, they were passing through. Their final destination wasn't the living, but the realm of the ancestors, the sky, the underworld, whatever cosmology the Hopewell adhered to, which, of course, we'll never fully know. And that's the sharpest irony. We know where these goods came from. We've traced their geochemistry. We've mapped their movement across the continent. We can even identify the quarries, the shell beds, the copper veins. But we don't know the logic of the exchange, the rules of the network, or why the Hopewell were so willing to bury things that would have taken months or years to acquire. Because the question isn't, how did they trade? It's, why did they stop? Why did a network so vast, so complex, simply fade out? No final war, no collapse, just silence. The trail stopped, the obsidian was buried, the copper no longer gleamed from burial mounds, and all that was left was the dirt. And one more item, one more anomaly. An artifact discovered in an Ohio mound, bearing inscriptions not in native symbols, but in ancient Hebrew. A so-called relic so suspicious, so contested, that it sparked both theological dreams and academic outrage. Was it a forgery? Almost certainly. But the fact that it still matters tells us more about the modern mind than it ever could about the ancient one. Because the next mystery wasn't carved by the Hopewell. It was carved by the 19th century. And it refuses to die. The Newark Holy Stones. If prehistoric Ohio's mysteries are usually buried under layers of silence and soil, this one is buried under something far messier: human projection. Welcome to the tale of the Newark Holy Stones, a controversy wrapped in ideology, colonial anxiety, 19th century egos, and a Hebrew-inscribed artifact pulled out of an Ohio mound, like a riddle that wasn't meant to be solved, but was certainly meant to be believed. Let's begin in 1860. David Wyrick, an amateur archaeologist and local surveyor in Newark, Ohio, had a hunch. Inspired by the growing theories of the time that the mounds in the Midwest might not have been built by Native Americans but by some lost race, perhaps even the Israelites themselves, Wyrick decided to dig. And what he found, or claimed to find, set off a chain reaction of pseudoscience, theological speculation, an enduring myth that still refuses to fully die out. From a mound near the Newark earthworks, Wyrick pulled a stone roughly the size of a smartphone, inscribed with ancient Hebrew characters. On one side, a depiction of Moses holding the 10 Commandments. On the other, the actual commandments, carved into the black limestone in blocky, confident Hebrew script. This artifact would come to be known as the Decalogue Stone. A short time later, Wyrick uncovered a second artifact, the Keystone, a smaller stone shaped like a keystone, inscribed with more Hebrew phrases: Holy of Holies, King of the Earth, the Law of God, the Word of God, each message short, pious, and clear, and each one, apparently, suggesting something staggering, that ancient Israelites had made it to Ohio. The implications were biblical, literally. In the mid-1800s, America was in the throes of manifest destiny, Christian nationalism, and a frantic desire to insert Western religious narratives into the prehistoric landscapes of the New World. Native American cultures were either ignored or romanticized into oblivion. The idea that the Hopewell or Eddy could build geometrically precise, spiritually complex earthworks didn't sit well with many. So when the Newark Holy Stones emerged, they offered an alternate explanation, one that conveniently displaced native agency and replaced it with something more familiar, more European, and more theological. Except it wasn't real. Almost immediately, scholars and skeptics began to poke holes in the story. The Hebrew script on the Decalogue Stone was not ancient script, it was modern, more similar to 19th century block Hebrew than anything a genuine Israelite artifact would contain. The carving was suspiciously clean, the edges sharp, and the iconography, especially Moses in a toga-like robe, was anachronistic at best. Critics began whispering that the stones had been planted, maybe even forged by Wyrick himself or someone eager to support his theories. And then Wyrick died, by suicide, according to the official record. Theories about his death, his motives, and the stones only deepened. Were they a hoax? A prank? A sincere attempt at validation gone too far? Modern consensus is clear. The Newark Holy Stones are forgeries, likely created with sincere ideological motives, possibly to bolster the claim that the American continent had been touched by biblical hands. But regardless of their origin, the real mystery isn't the stones themselves, it's how powerfully they linger. Even today, there are corners of the internet, entire books, and fringe academic papers that treat the Newark Holy Stones as authentic. Museums display them, with heavy disclaimers. Documentaries reference them, and despite the mountains of debunking evidence, the narrative persists. That perhaps, just maybe, the lost tribes of Israel once walked the grasslands of Ohio. That desperate maybe is the real artifact here. Not the stone, but the need for it. The need to explain Ohio's past with someone else's mythology. The refusal to let the mound builders be indigenous. The fear that a native civilization could have understood geometry, astronomy, and sacred alignment better than anyone gave them credit for. And so, a forgery becomes a mirror reflecting more about the 19th century mind than any ancient hand. And while this mystery is widely considered solved, the next one refuses to be nailed down by logic, science, or archaeology, because what comes next isn't about language or religion or forgery. It's about giants. Big ones. Tall tales, literally. And the uncomfortable fact that, despite repeated debunkings, people still want to believe Ohio's giant skeletons lore. Let's set the stage. It's the 1802nd. Small-town newspapers are the social media of the day, filled with local scandal, global nonsense, and the occasional explosion of something you almost believe. And into this cultural soup, Ohio throws a bone, several, in fact, big ones. Reports start to pop up in town papers across the state. Giant skeletons found in burial mounds, 7 feet tall, 8, sometimes 9 or more, buried with copper crowns, wielding enormous stone tools, and always conveniently unearthed, just in time for an amateur archaeologist to make a name for himself. One such report out of Chillicothe claimed that a 9-foot-tall skeleton was found buried in a mound, with double rows of teeth and a jaw large enough to fit over a man's face. Another in Coshocton County boasted of giant bones, exceeding the height of any living man. Yet another near Serpent Mound claimed to uncover a burial vault containing unusually large human remains, complete with ceremonial artifacts. None of these accounts were peer-reviewed. Most can't even be traced to real excavations, and yet they spread fast because they were compelling. Because they offered something impossible, something grand, something that made the American past feel mythic. It wasn't enough that the mounds were impressive, they had to be the work of giants, literal ones. And then came the Smithsonian. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Smithsonian scientists began excavating mounds throughout Ohio and the Midwest. They found bones, yes, but ordinary ones, number 10-foot titans. No double-toothed demigods, just normal human remains, some of which did suggest tall individuals, but nothing beyond the realm of biological possibility. Still, the giant narrative persisted. Some began to suspect a cover-up. The Smithsonian, they claimed, was hiding the truth, suppressing evidence of a race of ancient giants because it didn't fit the neat timeline of human evolution. Others turned to the Bible, pointing to the Nephilim mysterious giants mentioned in Genesis as the possible origin of these mound builders. And like any good conspiracy theory, the lack of evidence became the evidence. Photos of giant bones, usually faked or misattributed, began circulating. Articles were clipped, copied, and reprinted without context. And soon, a full-blown pseudo-history took shape. That long ago, the land now called Ohio was home to a race of ancient giants, sophisticated, powerful, and eventually destroyed. None of this holds up to scrutiny. The giant bones described in newspapers almost always went missing. No museum has a verified example. And modern archaeology, painstaking, tedious, and rooted in actual data, has found nothing to support the legend. But again, the question isn't whether it's true, it's why people want it to be. Maybe it's a desire for grandeur, to believe that our past was bigger, stranger, more epic than we are now. Maybe it's a subconscious guilt for building modern cities on ancient graves, for erasing native history and rewriting that history as fantasy feels easier, more heroic. Or maybe it's just folklore that got stuck, a story told too often, too loudly, until it calcified into something mistaken for truth. But what makes the giant skeleton's lore linger isn't bones, it's emptiness. The fact that something so obviously untrue can live for so long, sustained by repetition, fear, and the longing for myth. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because the next mystery came out of the ice, full-grown, intact, and still filled with secrets. The bones were real. The stomach was full, and for once, it wasn't myth that made scientists nervous. It was meat, burning tree mastodon, Licking County. Let's end where time begins, the Pleistocene, Ohio's Ice Age past, when mastodons roamed the ancient wetlands, and the idea of a state was as distant as the stars. There were no earthworks yet, no effigy mounds or sacred circles. Just glaciers peeling back from the land, rainforests giving way to grasslands, and megafauna ambling through the shifting landscape like slow-moving questions. And one of those questions would remain frozen in the ground for over 11,000 years, until the 12th of December, 1989, when a backhoe operator near Heath, Ohio, hit something unexpected. Not bedrock, not a utility line. Tusks. A team from the nearby Burning Tree Golf Course was digging a pond when they uncovered the most intact mastodon skeleton ever found in North America. Nearly complete, articulated, with tusks still attached. With ribs, spine, skull, pelvis all there, preserved in a pocket of low-oxygen muck, as if the creature had only just lain down to rest and forgot to get back up. But this wasn't just a well-preserved fossil. This mastodon still had its stomach contents. Preserved plant matter, seeds, twigs, gut bacteria, digestive sludge, so fresh by paleontological standards that scientists were able to identify dozens of plant species, reconstruct the animal's last meals, and even isolate living bacteria still active after 11 millennia. This was not just a skeleton. It was a snapshot, a freeze frame from the end of the Ice Age. A bridge between eras, between extinction and memory. It was Ohio's own Rosetta Stone in the form of a prehistoric elephant. And here's where things get strange. The bones showed unusual markings. Some researchers suggested the mastodon had been butchered, its ribs and vertebrae showing signs of damage that might indicate human activity. Not conclusive, not decisive, but suggestive. A few cuts here, a possible percussion mark there, enough to raise eyebrows. The timing matches up. Humans were in Ohio by then. Paleo Indians, Clovis tool users, wandering bands of hunters who certainly knew how to take down big game when needed. The Welling site, not terribly far away, already offered clues of seasonal encampments and resource collection. It wouldn't be a stretch to imagine a group of Ice Age hunters targeting a weakened mastodon near a watering hole. Not heroic, not cinematic, just hungry. But no stone tools were found with the Burning Tree specimen. No clear kill site, no weapons, no camp. So while the theory of butchery remains, it's contested. Some say the marks came post-mortem from trampling, scavengers, or even the pressure of sediment. Others argue they reflect intentional processing. Bones broken for marrow, ribs split for easier transport. Science didn't settle the matter. It complicated it. Even more bizarre, the bacteria found in the gut, still alive, still viable, after all that time. A microcosmic survival, tucked away in the digestive tract of a creature extinct before the pyramids were a glimmer in anyone's eye. What do you even do with that kind of discovery? At one point, researchers considered reviving the bacteria for further study. What could we learn about ancient gut flora? Evolution? Pathogens? Others hesitated. Releasing ancient microbes into the modern world has a distinctly science fiction energy, equal parts exhilarating and horrifying. The debates echoed in the scientific community and in pop culture. The Burning Tree mastodon wasn't just a fossil. It was a kind of prehistoric Pandora's box. Full of data, full of speculation, full of stories waiting to be told, misinterpreted, or sold. And sold it was. In one of the more controversial turns in Ohio archaeological history, the mastodon was eventually sold to Japan, where it now resides in a museum near Tokyo. The decision sparked outrage among local historians and researchers who saw the specimen as part of Ohio's scientific heritage, a once-in-a-lifetime find that slipped through the fingers of the institutions most eager to protect it. Some say the sale was pragmatic, others say it was a failure of stewardship. Either way, the burning tree mastodon, though native to Licking County, is now a kind of exile. Its bones sit in another hemisphere. Its stomach, once full of Ice Age plants, now preserved in laboratory slides and memory. But its mystery remains here. Because if a creature could die 11,000 years ago and still hold living microbes, what else could be waiting? Beneath the bogs? Under the fields? In the layers we haven't yet touched? This mastodon reminds us that extinction isn't always clean, that death doesn't always mean silence, that the past can stay alive in places we least expect, inside bones, inside soil, inside us. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. We end where we began, surrounded by questions, 33 of them, each one refusing closure, each one asking us not to solve, but to listen, to the earth, to the dead, to the absence of answers, because sometimes mystery is the message, and Ohio has been whispering for a long, long time.